Welcome to the Ty Beal Show, where we discuss food, science, and life. I'm Ty Beal, a scientist at the Global Alliance for Improved Nutrition, or GAIN. My guest today is Dr. Kevin Hall, a renowned expert in human nutrition, metabolism, obesity, and neuroscience. Dr. Hall is a former senior investigator at the National Institutes of Health, or the NIH, whose pioneering research uses the precision of metabolic wards and neuroimaging to uncover the fundamental mechanisms driving obesity and diet-related disease. In our conversation, we discuss his new book, Food Intelligence, the science of how food both nourishes and harms us. A quick note before we start. This podcast is separate from my role at GAIN. Okay, let's dive in. Dr. Kevin Hall, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me.
I'm really excited to speak with you about your new book, Food Intelligence, which I just listened to, just finished it up last week. But before we get into that, could you tell us a little bit about your background? So you went from being a physicist, if I understand correctly, to
I don't know if I was a
nutrition?
practicing physicist, but I definitely did my undergraduate and graduate degrees in physics. But even for my PhD studies, I was starting to look at cardiac arrhythmias in animal models and doing mathematical modeling of those arrhythmia mechanisms and trying to come up with better diagnostics and better ways to kind of pace out of those arrhythmias. So it was very biologically related. So it's not like I was a particle physicist coming into coming into the field. But yeah, basically after my PhD, I got a job at a little startup biotech company in the San Francisco Bay Area, and they gave me the instructions that I was to lead their type 2 diabetes computational model development program. And I was like, wow, that sounds great. What's diabetes? And so that's where I kind of fell in love with nutrition, endocrinology, metabolism, and really had a blast for 4 years working with different pharmaceutical companies developing this computational modeling tool with my colleagues at this little company to see what we could do to simulate human metabolism and endocrine function in a computer. So
Wow.
yeah, it was a lot of fun. And then I moved to the National Institutes of Health in Bethesda, Maryland, where I started my own lab. First doing mostly the computer modeling stuff still, although kind of halfway through the tenure track program, I got some encouragement to switch and start to run some clinical studies to at first just test some of our mathematical model predictions. But again, sort of fell in love with doing these sort of metabolic ward trials, and yes, stuck there for I guess a little over 20 years until recently left in April.
Wow. Well, I'm really glad you followed that pursuit because some of your work is the most rigorous that I've seen. I think that probably has to do with your uh, attention to detail and probably something about your training in physics. I've heard that physics is the hardest of all the science, hardest meaning hard and soft science compared to many. So I had a colleague who was a astrophysicist in their undergrad and became a nutrition food economist, and
Oh,
so
great.
I found
Yeah.
it interesting. Well, so let's talk about this book. It's called Food Intelligence, right? Can you tell us what do you mean by that word? What does it mean to you, and why did you choose that?
Yeah, no, it's interesting. And we that wasn't the original title. Our working title for actually years was Why We Eat,
Mm,
which was really trying to focus fundamentally on what are the forces driving, why we choose to eat, why do we need to eat in the first place, and that sort of thing. Food intelligence kind of came back after our publishers said, yeah, we don't really like why we eat. We're not big fans of that. We got to come up with something else. But it stuck out because one of the things that we noticed about books, popular books in this space, is that they often have a very specific point of view about a particular kind of diet or a particular kind of weight loss program. Often you'll see many
hmm
books in this space sort of flooded with those sorts of things. And what really kind of seemed to us to be a missing piece was giving people like this sort of background knowledge about, what is it about our food that we eat that nourishes us? How does it harm us? what actually happens inside the body when we choose to eat different kinds of foods with different macronutrient compositions, for example, and give people the sort of intelligence to look at the space of that they're bombarded with in social media and as well as on the bookshelves, the intelligence about food to kind of be able to better understand, what's kind of probably going to be bunk and what's probably science based, and how can we tell the difference, and what's been the history of how we know what we know, what is still the open landscape, and why we should still have a lot of humility about food, and what we still don't know, and what the vistas of scientific exploration that we have to kind of pursue in the future. What's the
Hmm.
cutting edge? What's hype? What's not so much hype? What's promising versus and maybe a little too early to be marketed versus what's obvious nonsense. And so, yeah, giving
Yeah.
people that sort of intelligence and the background is kind of what our goal was.
Well, I really appreciated it. I was impressed that I know quite a bit about this area, but I learned a lot from reading the book. So
Oh, wonderful.
there's a lot in it for I think all levels of knowledge. And for me, of course, this is what I love. So it was fascinating, the narrative, the way that it was framed. I think some of the deep dives into the regulatory histories of the FDA and different things. I think that was really fascinating, kind of enlightening. But let's start a little bit in this framing of this landmark study. You're well known for this original study that in 2019 was published, which I think was really the first randomized controlled trial that directly tested this sort of effect of a ultra processed diet versus an unprocessed diet or minimally processed diet. And it's gotten a lot of attention over the years. I'm sure you've talked about it quite a bit. Um, you did a great job trying to match for things like calories, sugar, fat, fiber, so that you could really distinguish what is it about the processing that is uh, potentially causing overconsumption or health issues. Can you tell us a little bit about what you thought was going to happen going into this study? What were your expectations?
Yeah, so yeah, maybe a little bit of background. I'd sort of heard about this concept of ultra processed food, actually for the first time meeting a couple of dietitians from Brazil, who it turns out had nothing to do with Carlos Montero's team. They were just, I guess, very inspired by the team that developed the NOVA classification system. I was giving a talk at an obesity society conference on some other work that I'd done on a metabolic ward trial looking at restriction of dietary carbs versus fat. And they came up to me afterwards and said, that was a really interesting talk, but, you're really looking at very 20th century way of thinking about foods in terms of their nutrients. And, have you heard about this concept of ultra processed food and this way of classifying foods based on their, extent and purpose of formulation and processing? And I'd never heard of it. And we were at an obesity conference, and I was like, well, what is it that you think is about diets high in ultra processed foods that might be driving obesity? Because that's a causal sort of claim, and
Hmm.
they couldn't point to any trials in the area, but they kind of had some proposed mechanisms, and their proposed mechanisms were that these foods tended to be high in salt, sugar, and fat, and therefore could drive overeating as a result of these combinations of nutrients. And I said, well, wait a second, you just named a bunch of nutrients. So what is it, right? Is it nutrients or is it something about the processing? I was very skeptical of this idea. And I had just read
Hmm.
Michael Moss's really excellent book, Salt, Sugar, Fat, and he makes a pretty compelling case about how foods can be formulated in ways that can really promote overconsumption and benefit food manufacturers in the way that they can sell their products, and they might have negative health consequences. But so my goal was, okay, well, if there's something to this ultra processed food idea, and there hadn't been a randomized controlled trial, so I figured no matter what the results of that trial would be, it would probably be quite impactful, and it's important to kind of do these things.
Hmm.
And if it really is something about the salt and the sugar and the fat, I should probably try to match the diets for those components. And so when I first kind of came up with this idea of doing this trial, I went to the dietitians and the chefs who do all the real work of putting these things together at the NIH Clinical Center. And the original idea was, could we make like a food for food comparison? So like make a lasagna from scratch and then buy an ultra processed version from the store
Uh,
and match food for food in that way. And it became pretty clear very early on that that was just going to be an undertaking that we did not have the capacity to do at that time. It was just like too much work to kind of do it food by food. And so then the question was, okay, well, could we purchase, a lasagna that was in the minimally processed category, at least maybe the processed category, category 3 Nova versus category 4 Nova, and do it that way? And then it
hmm
ran into the problem of, well, then we don't really know what's in the foods that aren't in the USDA's database for the branded foods. And so if we're sticking to that, then we kind of have to narrow down our food selections. Otherwise, you're going to have to chemically analyze all the foods if you want to match for salt, sugar, fat, and fiber. And it's like, okay, well, that's another undertaking. So we decided to just
yeah,
do what we ended up doing, which is like, let's match the overall diets for salt, sugar, fat, carbs, fat, protein as much as we could in that original study, and yet just select foods that are very minimally processed in one condition, and then 80% or more of calories coming from ultra processed foods in the other condition. And because we're using real foods still, lots of other things vary. I think that's one of the things that the Monday morning quarterbackers in
yeah,
that criticize nutrition studies often say, "Oh, well, you didn't match for this, you didn't match for that." It's like, yeah, that's when you use real foods, it's very hard to kind of match for all these things. The way you can do it is if you use like liquid formula diets or something like that, but then you're already now way far removed from like any
what
sort of
people actually
naturalistic
eat.
experience. And ours are already
Yeah,
far removed from that because these people live with us, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week for weeks on end and in these
right.
metabolic wards. So we designed the study in this way and just gave people really simple instructions: eat as much or as little as you'd like. Don't be trying to change your weight. And what they didn't know is that we were measuring all their leftovers. And our primary outcome was to calculate how many calories per day these people chose to eat, just to meet the same level of appetite on these two diets. And so going into it, I sort of thought, well, if we're matching for the salt, the sugar, and the fat, and even the fiber, then there shouldn't be much difference because that those are the things that really drive overconsumption of calories in when you formulate foods, and of course I was dead wrong, right? So that the
Yeah,
folks, when they were in the ultra processed diet condition, they overate calories, they spontaneously gained weight, gained body fat, and the same folks when they were in the minimally processed diet condition did the opposite. They lost weight and lost body fat.
yeah. It was pretty stark differences. So, this work has also been criticized. There's been a bunch of praise and a bunch of criticism recently. I'm sure you've seen some of this, but one of the pieces that I was just wanted to know about is, David Ludwig, Walter Willett, and another colleague, I think, wrote a paper in the BMJ about, the criticizing these short-term trials and
Mhm.
watch in, watch out effects. And from my understanding, this, this criticism of, saying this is short term, over the long term, what's going to happen? uh, Intake was converging. Maybe over time, the differences would level out. And there's a recent RCT that was led by Samuel Dickens in Nature Medicine that lasted for 8 weeks. And of course,
Mhm.
this is different diets. This was sort of aligned with healthy, UK healthy dietary guidelines, and there was still a big difference between the groups. And I think that that's pretty telling. Does that, from your perspective, answer the concerns? Is that eight
No, I
week
don't think
trial
it
or
does. I think that
not?
there are fair concerns, right? That you can't, and I never even imagined that this study would have the kind of impact that it ended up having, right? Um, but they're absolutely right to say, you can't extrapolate from a metabolic ward trial of 2 weeks on each diet what's going to happen over years, right? That's clearly
Hmm.
not what these kinds of studies are used for or what they're meant to conclude. You do need correspondingly larger, longer studies in more representative populations, in more realistic scenarios. Oftentimes, those kinds of trials are very difficult to do,
Hmm.
especially when you want to have a certain degree of adherence to the diets. I think that Sam and his team did a valiant job of trying to kind of keep the adherence very high. But even in that second period of the crossover, I think that there's some reasonable evidence that people were not adhering to the diets as well as they were in the first period of the crossover. So
Mm.
that's challenging when you have these kinds of outpatient feeding studies. It's not as big of a challenge for us because they don't have the opportunity to not adhere to the diet. So I think the
Right.
point is that we need to triangulate different kinds of study designs, which all have their strengths and weaknesses, in order to arrive at our best guess at what the evidence really shows. And that's all we can really do. And that's the
Mhm.
art of science, and that's kind of the way I approach it. So I take the criticisms as they're valid. And many of those criticisms are indeed valid. What I struggle with sometimes is this idea that, oh, if we kind of extrapolate the data beyond where the data were and make some claim that, oh, in a couple weeks the effect would have disappeared. I think what you're pointing out is, first of all, we didn't have the data on the metabolic ward trials. It's merely an extrapolation. Who knows? It meant the
Mm.
difference might have expanded over time. I prefer to look at the data we have versus imagining what potential data there might be had we done the study differently or longer. And you're
Mm.
right to point out that in Sam's study, where the diets were extended for longer periods of time. Although they didn't measure directly energy intake, they did measure these changes in body weight and composition, which likely are due to differences in energy intake as opposed to energy expenditure, for example. So yeah, I think the point is we need to triangulate evidence from lots of different kinds of studies, and we've done this historically for a long time, right? I mean, very
Mhm.
short metabolic ward trials were among the first to, investigate how saturated versus unsaturated fats affect LDL cholesterol levels, and how trans fats affect LDL cholesterol levels. And we could then combine it with observational data to look at what the relative proportion of these different kinds of fatty acids were in people's diets, and be able to kind of make stronger claims by looking at these different kinds of study designs, and all of them have their strengths and weaknesses to kind of converge on this. And I think that that's kind of what we're ending up doing with ultra processed foods as well.
Yeah, I think that's right. And just to kind of highlight, there are these three buckets that I can see when I'm listening to you. It's like the short-term trial that's very controlled. It's sort of like an efficacy trial where you're really doing everything you can to make sure you're looking at the actual differences. How much are people consuming exactly? Adherence is not an issue. There's a longer term trial, like Sam's study. Now that's a little bit more in the real world, which can be have
Hmm.
its benefits, but it also doesn't allow you to control as much, right? And then there's these longer cohort studies, which are observational in nature, much more applicable to how do people live and eat over years, but they're really prone to residual confounding and all sorts of other issues. So what you're saying is let's triangulate all of these data points and try to make some general conclusions about what can we know and what can we not know. I've always appreciated about you is that I really believe you want to know the truth, the evidence, the reality. You don't care what it is as long
That's
you just
right.
you really want to know it, right? You don't have an agenda other than you want to know that you want to I guess you do have an agenda. You want the science to be rigorous, right? You want the science to actually be qualified in the I guess the right way, right? And
Right.
interpreted
And
in
I
the
think
right
it's
way.
important to kind of, especially when it comes to these days where I think that there is a deficit of trust among the public about, what to believe. How do we, recognize what sources of evidence we should kind of trust in, which ones we should not trust in, is to recognize what are our strengths and limitations? What are the uncertainties? What can we know with greater versus less uncertainty? And and then I think what a lot of folks are also worried about is that people come up with very compelling and plausible sounding mechanisms of why they think that they're observing what they're observing, and that, as scientists, is what we do when we build models of kind of what we think is really going on. um, but that's not science. Science doesn't end there, right? A compelling sounding mechanism, and a really compelling narrative, especially told by a very charismatic person, who's citing a bunch of references that may or may not support what they're saying, which is often very hard to discern from social medias or even podcast interviews, right? Um,
Hmm.
is it can be really compelling, but that's not where science ends. And I think that we kind of need to recognize that we have uncertainties, and if that model is correct, we need to test it, right? We need to kind of critically test all of our models, and they're all wrong, right? Because our feeble human minds can't fully comprehend, what the world around us, and so we do our best to kind of explain what we have. Data alone isn't enough, right? Just kind of having the
Hmm.
data doesn't really. We need to weave it into a compelling sort of story, which actually makes better predictions about the world. And so um, I think it's really important. That's one of the things we try to emphasize in the book is that this aspect of collecting data, testing models, challenging what the kind of the prevailing view is, or what a popular model is making some predictions, is part of what science is all about. And you're absolutely right. My goal is to kind of try to design the best experiments that will test these different models. Like I said, the ultra processed food one was okay. Well, if there's something really about ultra processed food beyond these nutrients, then we should see a difference. If there's not, then there shouldn't be a difference. And no matter what way the experiment turns out, it tells us something interesting.
Hmm. I think it's also compelling that you weren't just doing the trial to try to like prove your point that you know, the processing doesn't matter. It's just the
Right.
nutrients or something, right? Like you truly wanted to know the answer, and you knew that it was important to actually know that answer. I like what you said about models. My Bayesian statistics teacher in my graduate program said, I think this was another statistician, but all models are wrong. Some are
Yep.
useful, right?
Right.
It's that
Right. No, that's
like they're
right.
always an approximation of reality, which I think people don't really understand that even with data, you're still modeling the data. But
Of
like you
course.
said, there are very different levels of quality of how that is done.
Hmm.
So speaking of this sort of the ongoing work, is there a trial that I heard something about? I saw you post a while back about an ongoing trial at NIH. Is there something that's still going on related to some of the mechanisms?
Yeah, so we actually, yeah, even since I left, that there was a trial that was ongoing. It's now completed and wrapped up. I've been presenting some of the main results at conferences and meetings. We don't have it published yet. We're writing up the manuscript now and hope to have a preprint posted by the end of the year. We'll see what happens. Um, but yeah, so we were kind of going back and asking the question, okay, well, like I said, there's lots of things that weren't matched between these two diets, right? They were matched for,
Hmm.
macronutrients and glycemic load and all sorts of other things, even overall energy density and whatnot. But lots of other things were not matched. And so the question was, what else could be potentially driving this difference between the diets? And their extent to which they promote overconsumption of calories and weight gain and body fat gain. And so we did what's called a post hoc analysis, looking back at the data that we'd already collected and tried to analyze it in various different ways and model, what variables that did exist between the diets might have explained the differences that we saw. And we saw lots of differences that could potentially play a role, but two that sort of popped out that I thought were particularly interesting was the first one was that when you remove the beverages from the diets, because some people think that beverages don't really contribute to satiation or satiety in the same way that solid foods do. When we removed the beverages, it turned out that the ultra processed meals had a higher energy density. The calories per gram of the meal, or another way to think about it, is every bite of food that you take, how many calories are probably likely on your fork when you take that bite of food, tended to be higher in the ultra processed diet. And interesting, it's not because the macronutrients differed, right? So we often think of high energy dense foods as being high in fat because fat contains more than double the calories as carbs and protein. It's because
Hmm.
the food matrix has been disrupted and the water has been extracted from these foods, and for good food safety and preservation reasons to prevent growth of bacteria and whatnot. But it ends up concentrating the calories when you extract all that water from the food. And so
Right.
for that reason, primarily these ultra processed foods tend to be higher in calorie density. And so that could potentially explain some of the effect. The other thing that I thought was interesting was that even though we matched for the salt, the sugar, and the fat and carbs in the diets, Tara Fazzino, a professor at University of Kansas, she'd come up with a definition of something called hyperpalatable foods, which were individual foods that had pairs of nutrients cross certain thresholds. So she defined thresholds for a food being high in sugar and fat, or high in salt and fat, or high in salt and carbs. And if an individual food crossed these defined pairs of thresholds, she labeled them hyperpalatable.
Mm,
And what she said was, "Well, yeah, I know that the overall meals were matched for these qualities, but what about the number of individual foods that were put on the plate? Did you present people with more individual foods that match these so-called hyperpalatable food nutrient combinations?" And it turned out that we did. The
mm,
ultra-processed meals had more of these individual foods that exceeded these nutrient threshold pairs. And so that seemed to potentially play a role. And so the study that we recently wrapped up at the NIH was to see if we could reformulate these highly ultra processed diets so that instead of them being high in both energy density and hyperpalatable foods, what if we varied those to match them more like the minimally processed diets? So still having 80% of calories coming from ultra processed foods, in one case, decreasing the number of hyperpalatable foods, but keeping the energy density high. And then in the other case, still having this ultra processed diet that was now low in energy density and hyperpalatable foods. And the question that we were trying to address was, if we randomize people in a counterbalance sequence to experience all of these now four different diets, a minimally processed and then these three ultra processed diets that varied in energy density and hyperpalatable foods, could we manipulate people's calorie intake? Could we reproduce the original results from the first study?
hmm.
And to what extent does energy density and hyperpalatable foods play a role in explaining what we observed in the first study? And so that study was recently completed, and it required 36 people to spend a month with us at the NIH Clinical Center, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, and rotate through these different combinations of diets, each for a week.
Wow, that's fascinating, and I can't wait for the paper. Can you give us the high level findings if you're up for that? Like,
Yeah.
what were the main, there's two mechanisms you highlighted, which I think are super important. You're talking about calorie density of the foods, of the meals, and then are there hyperpalatable foods? Are there more or less of those, right? So you kind of tested these in different combinations. What were the key findings?
Yeah, so the key findings is that, first of all, people did as they were told. They ate to the same level of appetite. They weren't trying to gain or lose weight. And this was 36 people, a pretty wide range of ages, pretty wide range of BMIs. It's slightly more men than women, I think, but pretty balanced group of folks. They ended up eating, if you compared the ultra processed diet that was high in energy density and high in hyperpalatable foods compared to the minimally processed diet, which was naturally low in energy density and lower in hyperpalatable foods, this time instead of 500 calories a day different, the average was about 950. So they were really
Wow.
eating a very substantial difference. Interestingly, and this was true of all of the different diets, they didn't report the meals being any more or less pleasant on any of the
Mhm.
different diets, which I think is encouraging. It means that, we can have people eating very different numbers of calories, but yet still reporting that they like the meals just as much,
I
which
think
I
that's
think.
such an important like distinction that a food can be hyper palatable, but it doesn't mean you like it more.
Yeah, yeah. No, it's one of those things, like I've talked about this quite a bit, is that it's almost I almost think that both ultra processed and hyper palatable are misnomers for what they're actually discussing. Because I've noticed a lot of folks so for example, food science and food technology criticize ultra processing because of its focus on the process as opposed to the formulation, right? So are these really ultra formulated foods? Are they ultra processed foods? What's the and it's a scary sounding name. And so are we really, what are, and I think that it's an open question about, how much is the processing per se? How much is the formulation per se? In this case, mentioned energy density being primarily about processing, right? Disrupting the food matrix, but it's also about formulation. It's about how much, carbs and fat and sugar and things like that you put into it. Um,
Yeah.
Similarly with hyperpalatable, right? It's really these pairs of nutrients crossing thresholds. It doesn't mean that that means that people report liking it anymore. And then there's this distinction in behavioral neuroscience and addiction science about the difference between liking foods and wanting, or liking anything and wanting it, right? There's
Yeah.
different motivational processes. They seems to be different neurobiological mechanisms, liking being mediated more by the opioid system, wanting more by the dopamine system. So I think both the terms might be a little bit confusing in terms of their names, right? But that's just, we have
Hmm.
to name them something. So, but in this
Yeah.
case, as in the previous study, people didn't report liking any of the meals more or less on these different diet conditions.
Okay.
Unlike
So
yeah, go ahead.
you've talked about the most extreme differences, right? The ultra
Yep.
processed food diet with high in energy density and this hyperpalatability with the qualification of the terms. The minimally processed diet that was low in both of those, 950 calories, huge. There were two other
Yep.
groups
Yeah.
in there as well.
Yeah, so when we keep the energy density of a highly ultra-processed diet high, but then reduce the number of hyperpalatable foods so that they're similar to the minimally processed diet, energy intake goes down by about 160 calories per day. So it's
Okay.
still quite a bit higher than the minimally processed diet. And then when you reduce both the energy density and the hyperpalatable foods, but still have an ultra processed diet, then there's no significant difference with the minimally processed diet in terms of how many calories per day people are eating. I think it's a little over 100 nominally, but it doesn't reach statistical significance.
Okay.
And then interestingly, when you compare that highly ultra processed diet that's low in both energy density and hyperpalatable foods to the weight changes that people experience during the minimally processed diet, they're both losing weight a little bit. And the other two
Mm.
diets, they're gaining weight and gaining body fat.
Yeah. So,
Interestingly, only the minimally processed diet led to body fat loss. So
right.
the people who are eating more or less the same number of calories on the ultra processed diet that's low in hyperpalatable foods and low in energy density, they're losing a little bit of weight, but their body fat is staying basically normal. And I think that's a really interesting, surprising finding that I don't have a good explanation for at this current period of time. But it suggests that there might be something else going on with respect to digestibility of the food, some energy partitioning aspects of ultra processed foods that are different than minimally processed foods. Um, yeah, so I think it's a really interesting finding. I'm looking forward to getting those results out there to the scientific community for their comments.
Wow. So just to sort of recap, when you shift the diets to this sort of high energy density, but you lower the hyperpalatability, you see a big difference still, but it's less than when the ultra processed food is, diet is high energy density and hyperpalatability. So it goes from maybe 950 calories more to about 800 calories more or something. But when you go to the low energy density and low hyperpalatability, two of those primary mechanisms, that's where you see, oh, look, these are actually relatively similar to in terms of energy intake and weight to the minimally processed diet. But you highlight body fat loss. So that also means that the participants that were on the minimally processed diets retained more muscle mass. Is that true
Well, we don't have
or
measures of
no?
muscle mass per se. What we have is fat-free mass. So we have fat, and then we have fat-free mass, of which fat-free mass is about 50% muscle, but it's also a bunch of fluid too, right? So
Mm,
and so we don't really know what the composition of the detailed composition of the body weight losses were.
okay.
We just know that body fat loss didn't happen in the ultra processed diet condition, despite seeming to eat similar numbers of calories. And I say seemingly because we're using nutritional software basically, we're not measuring all of the poop that these people are excreting and
Yeah.
measuring how many calories are in the poop. So how much was actually digested and absorbed is not something that we have measures of in this study. So that might lead to some errors in the nutritional software that makes certain assumptions about digestibility of these different foods. So
Mm.
I think there's definitely some open questions there as well.
That's fascinating. I have so many follow-up questions. I think first I'm thinking, how open, so how open do you think the food industry would be to shifting their foods to lower energy density and lower hyperpalatability? Do you think that that is there's a possibility that industry would say, "Sign me up for that. We'll get less profits from sales. We'll sell less overall
Yeah, of
products."
course, that obviously is not something that they will be happy to do on its own, right? They're not going
Yeah,
to be, certainly not unless there's some sort of mandate and some sort of policy that's kind of underlying why they would be incentivized to do that. Um, it's very unlikely that industry would voluntarily make any sorts of changes, for that matter, that are likely or that even have the potential to hurt sales. Right? I mean, I think that we've seen that the food industry is often happy to create a new, a new line of products that might meet those kinds of designations, but they're not going to remove the old ones. And the new line would be, if they're healthier and probably will cost them more to make, they'll probably cost the consumer more to purchase and therefore will not probably have a very high uptake either. So
right,
yeah, I think that's where we get to the question of how do we incentivize the food industry to do the right thing, if it is something that's going to be beneficial to public health, and that's where obviously policies and regulations have to play a role.
right. And I just want to highlight too, so even if the body weight changes were the same, the body fatness was different. So there is still a potential benefit of minimally processed foods, even over these low energy density, low hyperpalatable, ultra processed foods. But there's also other factors that you didn't measure, which there's been a lot of this sort of actually there's a randomized controlled trial Carlos Mantero is telling me about as well on some of these other factors. But you have like mental health, you have markers of diabetes, heart disease, cancer, all of these other chronic
Hmm.
disease markers, right? And so you were not testing for that. So we still, I mean, of course, one of the key problems with ultra processed diets is their potential role in causing people to eat too many calories, right? Excess energy intake. But there's also these other potential mechanisms that could also play a role, right?
Yeah, no, it's absolutely true. One thing that we did get some funding before I left NIH to do was to do a bench to bedside collaboration with some folks at NIH to look at gut function, microbiome changes, and immune system changes that might occur with these diets. Because and in particular we started out by targeting these two diets that seemed to kind of they varied a lot in ultra processing, but they didn't seem to vary that much in terms of energy intake, so and weight change, right? So they're kind of
Hmm.
a nice controlled pair to look at and see if there's really changes in gut function. Kevin Whelan's group in the UK did a really nice study. I think it was in people with Crohn's disease, where he was looking at minimally processed diets, and in particular, certain emulsifiers that are being used in ultra processed foods that might exacerbate the symptoms of Crohn's disease. And so I think that there's, yes, these parallel pathways by which ultra processed foods or diets high in ultra processed foods might lead to worse outcomes that have almost nothing to do with energy intake and might have something to do
Hmm.
with the actual formulation of these foods, um, and the processing of these foods and how the gut experiences. I know we had a podcast episode with Merritt Colby on some of these potential mechanisms, right? But I think that
Right.
we're still stuck at that level. Unfortunately, these are hypothetical mechanisms that are plausible, and they really need to be experimentally tested. And so, yeah, we'll do a little bit of that in some of the secondary analysis of this current study, and but I think we need a lot more research in this area for sure.
Yeah. Okay. Well, you did another study, I think, on milkshakes.
Yes.
Can you tell us about that?
Sure. So again, we're interested in the question of, what is it about ultra processed foods that seems to drive overconsumption, and are there mechanisms in common with addiction? Because there's a lot of narrative about food addiction being, really prominent, playing a prominent role in why people are choosing these kinds of foods and why they might overconsume these kinds of foods and might lead to obesity. And this topic dates back actually very many years, to a very classic study back in 2001, that was published in the Lancet, where people did some neuroimaging with positron emission tomography to look at what's happening to dopamine receptors in the brains of people who either have obesity or don't have obesity. And one of the things that had been known for a long period of time, even at that point, was that people who have been addicted to drugs like cocaine or methamphetamine, when you use the same technology, the same positron emission tomography technology, they exhibit lower levels of dopamine receptors, these type 2 dopamine receptors in the reward regions of the brain. And of course, it was never clear whether or not that was predisposing people to addiction or if this was an adaptation to addiction. But it eventually became the model. The working model was that as people kind of experience these stimulant drugs, what tends to happen is that they cause a very large increase in dopamine in the brain, much larger than you get with kind of more natural stimuli that we've evolved to experience, these sort of supernormal stimuli. And as a result, there's an adaptation process that takes place where the dopamine receptors sort of downregulate to kind of kind of normalize the signal over time. And as a result of that, over time, with repeated exposure to this drug stimulus, you get less and less of the rewarding aspects of the stimulus because dopamine receptors are going down, and in addition to that, the amount of dopamine that's being secreted upon repeated exposure goes down. So this is a kind of a classic model of a neurobiological model of what goes on inside the brain when people
Mm-hmm.
become addicted to drugs of abuse. And so there was a similar sort of narrative as starting in that 2001 paper. It's like, oh my gosh, like people with obesity seem to have a downregulation of these dopamine receptors to the same extent as people who are addicted to cocaine. This is like the beginning of this idea of food addiction being like cocaine addiction, having the
Right.
same sort of neurobiological processes. And that has become even more acute now with the discussion of ultra processed food addiction, in particular, addiction to ultra processed foods that are high in fat and sugar, these kind of hyper palatable combinations of nutrients. And so we decided quite some time ago to do a study where we said, okay, well, look, if obesity is kind of related to ultra processed food addiction, then we should be able to see something quite similar. We should be able to kind of make some predictions if that model is correct. The first thing is that we should also see a downregulation of the dopamine receptors in people with obesity. And when we give people with obesity who might be addicted to these kinds of foods already, this supernormal stimulus of an ultra processed milkshake high in fat and sugar, they should see a reduction in dopamine levels, but it should still be pretty high in comparison to people who are lean who wouldn't be addicted to these kinds of foods. So this
Mm-hmm.
again, it's this sort of model of addiction. We're testing a couple different hypotheses there in the study where we basically said, okay, well, let's use the same PET technology that our colleagues in addiction research use, and we'll study people from a very wide range of adiposities, a wide range of BMIs, and we'll give them the same ultra processed milkshake high in fat and sugar, and we'll observe this dopamine response. And the prediction is that the people with obesity will have lower levels of dopamine receptors, kind of similar to that 2001 paper,
Mm-hmm.
and that they'll also have a lower level of dopamine released after these ultra processed milkshakes compared to the people who were lean. And lo and behold, we didn't see either of those effects, right? It turned out that the people with obesity don't have lower dopamine receptors. They actually have more dopamine at baseline to begin with. And so we figured that out by giving two different PET tracers, one that binds more weakly than the other to dopamine receptors. And we showed that whereas one was decreasing with adiposity, the other one was staying the same. So basically indicating that endogenous dopamine was displacing the more weakly bound tracer in the
Mm-hmm.
PET study. So that 2001 paper we think was an artifact of the fact that they used the more weakly binding dopamine, that the more weakly binding dopamine receptor tracer, and that basically people with obesity have more dopamine around, not less receptors. And then the more controversial thing was that we couldn't actually detect a measurable change on average in dopamine when people were eating or drinking these after they drank these ultra processed milkshakes high in fat and sugar. And that was completely surprising to us because we'd sort of assumed that this was going to happen because other papers in the past had reported that when people actually consume foods that you see this dopamine effect, and we didn't see it. And we
Hmm.
were initially very surprised by this. And not only that, but it was the effect that we did observe was very variable, and it didn't relate to adiposity. It didn't relate to how, so again, kind of contradicting our original hypothesis. So we had more or less a null result, and it suggested that maybe this narrative that ultra processed foods high in fat and sugar, and that people who have obesity because they might be addicted to these kinds of foods, well, the neurobiological mechanisms didn't seem to kind of track with what we would see in cases like drugs like cocaine or methamphetamine, where there is a long track record of observing these kinds of adaptations over time and seeing these dopamine results. We just didn't see it. It
Wow.
doesn't mean these foods can't be addictive. It doesn't mean that they might play a role in the development of obesity. It's just that this particular neurobiological mechanism didn't seem to correspond with what our model had suggested and what many people's model had kind of been and up until that point. Um, yeah,
Wow.
yeah. So anyway, that's kind of what we found. It was a little surprising. Maybe it's an opioid mechanism that might be playing a role. We'd have to design a different study to look at that. But this dopamine dependent mechanism doesn't seem to track with what we expected.
Okay. So it's not the end of the story, but at least one of the key ways that that these foods that were hyperpalatable were supposed to potentially drive this addictive behavior did not pan out. Uh, there's a distribution of people in these groups. So do you think it's still possible that, like, for some people they're addicting, and for some people they're not, and that averages out, and you
Yeah, I
know,
mean, so yeah, I should point out, like, you're right. There was a wide range, and we were really interested to see if we could understand, what was going on with that range. So this distribution of dopamine responses to the same milkshake. We did some exploratory analyses, and it turned out that if people were hungrier before the milkshake, they were more likely to have a response. If they actually wanted more of the milkshake after they'd finished it, they were more likely to have this dopamine response. And then when we did
mm,
a buffet meal afterwards, it turned out that the dopamine response to the milkshake, the ultra processed milkshake high in fat and sugar, also predicted how many of the ultra processed cookies high in fat and sugar people chose to eat in the buffet that took place a couple days later. So maybe there's still a subset of people who are particularly prone to these kinds of things, and I think it's intriguing. It's certainly intriguing data. But yeah, again, this at least we are not getting the sort of size of the signal that we had expected across the
mm,
board, and certainly not the distribution across adiposity that we had anticipated or had kind of included in our sort of working model of how this thing worked. It doesn't, also, I should be very clear, it doesn't mean that even though on average we didn't see a signal, it doesn't mean that there's no dopamine response. It's just that this PET method is relatively insensitive compared to for natural dopamine responses, right? So this
yeah,
idea that you there's lots of things that are pleasurable from day to day life, or kind of are motivating and increasing wanting, that don't lead to these super physiological increases in dopamine that you see with drugs of abuse, like cocaine and methamphetamine, or even nicotine, that's observed in many studies.
yeah, okay. This is so fascinating. I still think that your recent controlled trial that we talked about with these different levels of energy density and hyperpalatability, it seems to have answered, at least with some confidence, that energy density and hyperpalatability are two of the primary mechanisms by which ultra-processed foods drive overconsumption. Is that a reasonable conclusion?
I mean, again, in this very restricted setting, yes. I mean, I think that there's many other questions to answer with respect to that. But I think that's the most natural. interpretation of our study is that at least under these kind of relatively contrived experimental conditions where people are living with in a hospital ward and only exposed to these kinds of foods, that you can see huge changes in the number of calories that people decide to eat, even when they're instructed to just eat as much or as little as they want, and that energy density and hyperpalatable combinations of nutrients play a pretty substantial role in driving those things. One other thing that was kind of interesting also was that we were measuring how quickly people ate the meals, because another model for
Mm,
how these
right.
foods might work is that they tend to be softer and easier to chew and swallow, and tend to be eaten more quickly. And there was a nice trial called the Restructure trial led by Kieran Ford's group, where they took ultra processed meals and ultra processed diets and tried to change the texture, still being both ultra processed, but they could vary the number of calories people chose to eat by a few hundred calories per day, depending on the texture of the foods. In our study, actually, people ate the meals equally rapidly. So
Equally rapidly.
yeah, which was a surprise because in the first study, actually, they ate the ultra processed meals more quickly, and for whatever reason, in this new study, they didn't. They ate them at the same rate in terms of grams per minute.
Why do
So
you
I don't
think
know
that?
why.
Why do you think that is?
I don't know yet. I don't honestly. So we're still digging into the data. These are, like I said, this is pretty very recent results.
That's fascinating because not only your 2019 study, but the study in Japan that came out, I think,
Yeah,
last year found an
that's
eating
right.
rate of more of at least twice the rate in the ultra processed group as the
Yep.
unprocessed group.
Yeah. It's
So, but
it's a great question. I don't know the answer to the question, but at least we can say that. So I don't know why they're eating the meals at similar rates in this particular study, but at least we can remove that as a variable in explaining the big differences in calorie intake between the different diet conditions. Doesn't mean that it's not a potential player in other situations, and clearly was in these other studies. But yeah, for whatever reason, people ate the meals equally quickly in this particular study.
I think it gets to the question of trying to understand what drives the overconsumption along the pathway, but the two factors of energy density and hyperpalatability, either way, whether that's caused through eating rate or not, if they're driving overconsumption, and we know how to change, we know what actually is what the formulation or whatever the characteristics of energy
Hmm.
density, obviously, low water content, having lots of calories,
Yeah, yeah.
uh, hyperpalatability. Your colleague, kind of described what that is, containing
Hmm.
those combinations of foods, right? There's these, whether it's like salt and fat, right? Like fat and
Yep.
sugar, those types of things. So it still seems like if I'm looking at the data that's out there, and I also add in this study by Samuel Dickens that just came out, that what I take away from that is a couple things. So these two groups, they both lost significant weight over the course of 8 weeks compared to what they were at before, eating whatever diet they were eating, right? So I look at that and I think, okay, so probably along the lines of your study that you're writing up right now, this ultra processed diet that followed the dietary guidelines probably was lower in energy density, hyperpalatability. Those are two probably key things that were addressed somewhat in this healthy diet pattern. And I hear two interpretations of this study. The people who really don't like Nova and ultra processed foods, they say, look, ultra processed diet causes people to lose weight. Ultra processed diets can be healthier than normal diets. And then the other group says, look who lost a lot more weight, unprocessed healthy diet, or minimally processed healthy diet. So I
Hmm.
think that to me that tells you there's a whole degree of there's not black and white. You can have healthier ultra processed diets that are probably better than the standard American or the standard UK diet. And it doesn't mean that that's healthier than a minimally processed diet, right? There's sort of like it's a gradient of diet
Right.
quality. So I
Right. I
think
mean,
that's like,
yeah, I think the important point you're trying to raise is that the sort of standard diet that people are consuming now is so far removed from what people recommend, right? What dietitians recommend, what dietary guidelines or the Eat Well guide are recommending, is that it's a pretty low bar to improve upon, right? It's like,
It's pretty terrible, right? The diets are
yeah.
pretty terrible at
So
baseline.
the extent, and so some I think will argue, as you just did eloquently, saying that you can devise a highly ultra processed diet that improves upon people's regular diets and can lead to weight loss and can lead to improvements in a whole host of other outcomes. Because I think, again, one of the potential mechanisms by which ultra processed diets cause harm, or highly ultra processed diets might cause harm, is that they displace minimally processed vegetables and whole grains and fruits from people's diets, right? So it's not something about the ultra processed foods themselves, but the things that they're displacing that might be particularly problematic for people's health. So that's a completely separate mechanism, as opposed to trying to recognize something about the ultra processed foods themselves that cause harm. What is it that they're displacing? And in fact, when you look at the kind of the way that the Nova creators discuss ultra processed diets, and in fact, it's part of the definition of Nova 4 categories, that they're displacing foods from Novas 1 through 3, right? That they
Right.
actually observed like a decrease in Nova 2 products, like these culinary ingredients that people were choosing because people are cooking less at home.
Hmm.
So not that the sugar that these people were eating was necessarily something that they were purchasing to make their homemade versions was something that we should be missing. But the fact is, it's a commentary on how our food environment and the way that we interact with our food system is changing over time as well.
Right. And I think that there's a lot to be, I think, figured out in terms of the food environment that plays a role, because it's not just the food science and the biology of it. It's actually the social,
Mhm.
socioeconomic, cultural thing that really contributes to this, right? If you're surrounded by an environment where ultra processed foods are marketed to you, where they're very convenient, where they're very cheap, where other maybe healthier foods are more expensive, less accessible, you don't have as much skill to cook. It's not part of the culture to cook. And then cooking can also do other benefits. Maybe you're sitting down as a family. Maybe there's the mental health benefits and the community benefits of sharing a meal with somebody, right? Like you could
Mhm.
prepare a homemade pie that has essentially the same types of sugar, salt, and fat in it, whatever. Maybe it's slightly healthier, but it's not drastically different. But the actual experience of taking your time, you had to work to do it. You had people come over to eat it. It's very
Right.
different than you're alone. You're grabbing a bite to eat to keep your energy going while you're working at your desk. Very different environment, right?
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Yeah,
Yeah. And not to mention the fact that given all that work that you're putting into it, you're probably not going to do it every day either, right? It's just
that's
like,
huge, right? You
it's
don't
not
have
feasible.
unlimited access to constantly be making all of these types of hyper palatable, energy dense
Hmm.
foods all the time, right?
Right.
It's not like yeah, there's a certain amount of, I don't know if it's laziness or that we have so much to do, only so much time and effort, that having a box of cookies is very different than having to make the cookies from scratch. In
Absolutely.
terms of how
That's
many
right.
times you're going to choose to do that.
Even though
Well,
nutritionally and from a risk of obesity and other diet-related chronic diseases, I think that there's a fair argument to say that, yeah, your homemade cookies are probably they have a good chance of being just as bad for you as the ultra processed alternatives, apart from these kind of effects of some additives and preservatives that are included in the ultra processed version. But
yeah.
yeah, I mean, I think it's an important point, and it gets the fact of, there's a narrow set of the population who has the motivation, the wherewithal, the resources, the skills, the equipment, to kind of change their diet for the better in and resist the food environment, which is kind of pushing them in the opposite direction for the most part, right?
Mhm.
And I think a lot of the discussion around ultra processed foods has uh, really, shifted the political and the public conversation around our food systems in really encouraging ways. But I think it has a lot of potential downsides when it comes to, okay, well, we all, as a planet of soon to be 10 billion people, We all need to eat. We all need to get our food from somewhere. Ideally, it should be healthy food that's sustainable for the planet and the population. Um, and and how are we going to have that situation? And how are we going to engineer that society so that we can actually have that sort of situation where we all have,
Hmm.
equitable access to healthy diets that are sustainable for the future? And so I think it's important to kind of consider that. I think my view is that ultra processing in terms of food technology and food science is going to play a major role in that. I think that
Hmm.
there's I don't think we can go back to a time where there is no past utopia where we can point to
Yeah.
that didn't
Yeah.
exist in the past, where one member of our family was chained to a kitchen for 3 or 4 hours a day, and then even further back in time wasn't dealing with nutritional deficiencies and whatnot, right? So there isn't a past that we can point to say, this is the time where humanity had it all figured out. At least pre-agriculturally, maybe they did, but but
We're
post-agriculturally,
not going back to hunter-gatherer
yeah,
days. I'm pretty sure
exactly.
of that.
Certainly not
But
10 billion hunter-gatherers in the planet,
probably
right?
need a slightly larger planet. But
Yeah.
I think what you're saying is very true. It's like we need both. Like
Hmm.
I just talked to Carlos Manchero, who of course developed Nova with colleagues, and he had this really, I think, insightful view that that Barry Popkin kind of coined this term, the nutrition transition,
Yep.
where as countries develop, as they gain more wealth, they very commonly consume more of these ultra processed foods, gain weight. You see a transition somewhat of this undernutrition to this often called overnutrition or this sort of excess calorie intake, right? And for those populations like the US or the UK, where that transition has already occurred, where the majority of calories are from ultra processed foods, it's going to be very hard to try to have everybody just go back to some some form of traditional diets of
Yep.
100 years ago, right?
Right.
And in populations now where the transition is very early, where ultra processed foods make up a very small portion of the
Hmm.
diet, we see rapid increases. And you look at data from Euromonitor, increases in Africa and Asia are actually quite substantial, even though they're low right now.
Right.
And so Carlos's point is that, look, we can try to prevent that it doesn't have to be inevitable that they follow the exact same path
Yep. That's right.
if there's intervention now. But like you're saying, there's not either. I don't think there's I don't think we're going to be eating 100% diets of ultra processed foods or zero. It's going to be,
Right. Right.
we want traditional foods. We want to encourage cooking. We want to encourage fresh produce. And in this current modern world that we live in, there is always going to be a role for some type of ultra processed or highly processed foods. It's about addressing and finding a way to do this in a way that produces foods that is not contributing to these diseases. The food environment needs to change, right? The policies need to
Right.
change.
And
I
and
think
what
about,
Yeah, I
go
was just
ahead.
going to say, and what products can we already use that are on the marketplace that might be considered ultra processed that are actually going to improve people's diets and still make them, relatively
Mhm.
inexpensive and convenient? We're not going to have people
The
cooking their
cost
own
and the
bread, right? Like
time.
baking their own bread every day or something, or even
Yeah.
like relying on a
Yeah.
small bakery around the corner, right? But many of these whole grain bread products, I mean, from a nutritional perspective, are probably good choices. Certainly better choices than like a very highly refined, even freshly baked bread that you could make in.
White flour. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly, right. So I think that while I think that ultra processed foods and the Nova classification system have really, created a renewed focus on the quality of the foods that we're eating, we also don't throw out everything else that we know about nutrition along the way, right? That the
Hmm.
nutrients do matter, and old ways of even categorizing foods matter, right? In terms of vegetables and fruits and dairy and poultry and things like that,
Hmm.
and to the extent that those dietary patterns that may be higher and lower in ultra processed foods, they can also vary quite a lot in terms of these other nutritional profiles. And I think
Yeah.
that the way I sort of view it is that they're complementary, right? I think it's one of the interesting things that people say it's a disadvantage that the NOVA categorization system doesn't consider the nutrients directly in its classification system. I think it's an advantage because it provides a kind of complementary lens upon which to look at a dietary pattern in
Yeah.
addition to the nutrient profile. And so we need both to kind of really kind of, again, sort of triangulate towards what are the best um, kind of the best bets for improving our food system as we move forward.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think that there's a lot of nuance in terms of which foods, especially in the wealthy countries that have high consumption of ultra processed foods, which ones are the most problematic,
Yep.
which ones are benign or potentially beneficial, right? And it all depends on and compared to what. I feel like we know so much, a lot of your work, but all of the work together, we know so much about some of the most worst offenders. I mean, there's a lot of consensus around sugar sweetened beverages.
Yep.
Almost
For sure.
nobody, right, would could debate that. Um, but these two mechanisms of energy density, hyperpalatability, to me, I think as you said, we need ongoing research for sure. And at the same time, we have so much knowledge about what would improve things in terms
Hmm.
of the science of the biology and the mechanisms that it's really the big obstacle to me is how do we change the food environment and what are the policies or interventions that actually will move the needle?
Hmm.
Because like you said, if we identify hyperpalatability and high energy dense ultra processed foods, just knowing that doesn't really do anything
Right.
about reducing those. It's like, duh, like people are going to eat foods that are hyperpalatable and higher in energy density. They're going to eat more calories than they would
Right.
if they were low in those. So in
Yeah.
some sense, it's sort of obvious. But I think the challenge there is then, what do you do about it? On the policy side, we have this capitalist society, and it's a global food system where companies are really needing to deliver growth to shareholders. And the key way that you have growth with these types of products are by increasing sales, right?
Hmm.
And consumption. To increase sales, you have more consumption. So I think it's you said they're sort of at odds, and you have to regulate, but how do you actually do that and work with the food providers? So work with industry in a way that can recognize that they have a role to play. All of our food
Yeah.
just about comes through food industry. How do we work
Right.
with them?
Yeah. I mean, I think that it's a really interesting question, right? Because first of all, I think because of exactly what you said, we should realize that the default mode is to resist any sort of change, right? And that they're going to fight it, and we just have to realize that that's going to be part of the game, right? So any new policy that the FDA puts forward, any regulation that's going to be put forward, you're going to see lawsuits, right, from the food industry resisting that change, and that should be expected and needs to be planned for so that what and the FDA does this, right? Whatever new regulation that they're looking at, they want to make sure it's as rock solid and defensible as possible. And part of that is having the best science to kind of support those decisions and those new regulations.
Hmm.
So I think that we should realize that that's part of it. The other thing that we should realize is that regulations are not necessarily going to they don't have to be punitive necessarily, right? And they should also not just be focused on reducing the harmful products, but incentivizing better products, right? So
Hmm.
I think that too often when it comes to policies and regulations, we take a page out of the very successful tobacco playbook, right, which has been focused on, warnings and labels and taxation being the primary way that tobacco consumption decreased substantially in countries like the US and the UK and Canada and other places around the world. Those were the main reasons. The difference with food is, of course, we all have to eat. None of us have to smoke or use tobacco
Hmm.
products. And so we need to have an equally robust policy mechanism and regulatory mechanisms to promote and expand the market for healthier versions or healthy products that the food industry can participate in, right? And
Hmm.
so I think that we need both of those things. But we shouldn't expect the food industry to just kind of come along and play ball without without the stick of the policy and regulatory lever, right? So,
Yeah.
a story I tell in the book is before I left the NIH, I was proposing a big program that would be government sponsored to work with the food industry to actually figure out how could we re-engineer, some of the widely consumed foods that are potentially problematic into ways that they might actually be healthier for people, and actually design trials to demonstrate the effects of those changes. So things like if it's energy density and hyperpalatable combinations, well, let's see if we can re-engineer foods so that they don't have those attributes but are still enjoyed by people, and
Hmm.
they might be more expensive, but you could subsidize those kinds of products in some way.
Hmm.
Unfortunately, without that potential for the regulatory stick, and when I went to more than a dozen food companies saying, "Would you be willing to consider accepting money to participate in this program and like contribute some expertise to like how we might re-engineer these foods?" All but three of these companies said, "Yeah, we're not interested. We're not willing to kind of participate in such a study, or such a program of research, because there are downsides, there are risks, right? There are risks that we could find out that, yeah, it's actually really difficult to re-engineer some of these products, and even though we kind of gave them the potential for complete anonymity and that we wouldn't use branded versions of their products in the test, they were still like, yeah, we're not interested in doing this. So so I think that the idea that the food industry is going to just play nice and help us with this without like some sort of kind of policy and regulatory stick in the background is a little bit delusional, which I hear a lot of folks in the sort of nutritional science saying, "Oh, we got to work with them. They're our partners in this." And yeah, it's like, I don't know. We've got to have a little bit of both the carrot and the stick in this process. And so I think that does come down to, let's take what we know or what we have good evidence for, like what you suggested. Obviously, we know a lot about what causes, poor outcomes in terms of diet-related chronic diseases. We know certain product
Hmm.
categories are playing a big role, and we know certain nutrient combinations and deficiencies in other aspects of the diet are playing a role. What are the sort of policies that we can put in place, given what we now know, that will kind of incentivize both better products on the market and disincentivize the consumption of products that are currently harmful on the market?
Hmm. I'm curious, Kevin, do you think that this, I mean, carrot and the stick approach, where you're having positive incentives and negative incentives, I think is important. If I understand correctly, what you're suggesting is not just replace ultra processed foods with minimally processed foods. Of course, that to some extent, that's a big part of things, I think. But what you're saying is also identify the worst offenders and shift from harmful, particularly harmful ultra processed foods, to understanding and incentivizing healthier products in place. Do you do you think that there's, to bring the food industry along with this, one option, of course, a company could divest from certain types of products, and shift to, because those are their highest profit, right? But if they
Hmm.
have the incentive the regulatory incentive, the stick to do that, maybe that could happen. I think that, uh, would is it realistic to think that the actual portfolio of ultra processed foods could drastically reduce with enough policies? Or do you see that being a big challenge, and that's why you're saying, look, and because of the convenience and because of the shelf life, the time use, the cost, all of that stuff, you think that maybe a like for like in terms of ultra processed food that's really unhealthy being replaced by a healthier version of that same type of thing enables a food industry to adapt more easily?
Yeah, I mean, I think what I'm not talking about is making healthy Twinkies or something like that, or healthy Fruit Loops, right? And I
Yeah.
don't think taking the food dye, the petroleum-based food dyes out of Fruit Loops makes them a health food, right? I think, but the point is that there are kinds of products that are consumed by a large number, substantial fraction of the population, that they actually make a difference to public health. One example being pizza in America, right? Pizza in America is consumed at a level which is I mean, it's one of the most popular foods in America, and it's consumed in the kind of pizza that's consumed. If you look at the refined flour in the crust, and you look at like the huge amounts of saturated fat and the cheese and the toppings that are being used, you could substantially reformulate pizza, even the frozen pizza aisle, right? That's in people's supermarkets. And in
The
fact, this has
sodium,
been,
they're really, really high in
yeah,
sodium,
really
right?
high in sodium. Yeah. So, for example, Mike Lean, University of Glasgow, he's a nutritional sciences professor. He worked with a entrepreneur. I forget this Donnie. I can't remember his last name. And they created basically using the UK Eat Well guide, a nutritionally complete and healthy version of pizza,
Hmm.
which is more expensive. But they have a company. It's doing reasonably well. But it's not competitive with the big makers right now. But you can imagine if you incentivize more of these companies to kind of follow that lead by saying, you know what, if your pizzas don't meet certain nutritional profiles, then it's going to be subject to taxes. If it does meet that profile, maybe you're not subjected to any tax, right? So
Hmm.
in other words, using the carrot and the stick. And people have done, as we can criticize modeling studies, but there was a plus one modeling study to say just in the U.S., if we improve the nutritional quality of pizza, could we actually impact public health? And it turned out we could, right? It's like it's
Hmm.
just this one
And it's just
food,
one food, a single
one
food,
food,
because it's
right?
so widely
Nutrition,
consumed.
yeah, it could
Yeah.
actually impact public health. So that's the kind of thing that I'm talking about. And so, how do we put in place the incentives to take something that would normally, yeah, right now there would be the way that it would work would be, oh, people in the food industry would say, well, we're not going to remove our current pizzas. We're going to keep them at the current low price. Sure, if there's a market for it, the healthy version, we'll make that as well as our current version, and we'll capture a new segment of the market that was never going to buy our original product in the first place. And that's not what I'm talking about, right? Because
Hmm.
that still is just going to benefit the few people who are already health conscious and not going to impact public health in the same way as it
Right.
would be if you then made the existing product as expensive or lowered the price of the new product in a way that actually makes the incentives opposite, and yet is still using ultra processed food technology in a way to mass produce these things, but they have a much better nutritional profile. And
Right.
we continue to invest in the science to make sure that whatever the processing techniques and the additives and preservatives and things that are going to be included in this new purportedly or potentially healthier for you product are in fact safe, right? So I think that's the
Right.
other frustration, is that you do need to keep doing the science to make sure we're not introducing something into the food system that is potentially problematic, which is of course something that's currently not done either, right? Which is we
Right.
don't have that sort of
Yeah.
guardrail in place.
I would love to see a major reduction in ultra processed foods overall because they're so high, 60% of calories in the
Hmm.
US. But like you said, for the ultra processed foods that remain, there's just a lot of common sense switches that you could make. I mean, if you think about even just going from refined grain to whole grain, that would make a big difference. I look at some of these key things like the sodium to potassium ratio. I
Hmm.
mean, if look at any food product that has a label, one way to tell how much of the real food is in there, kind of the nutritional value of it, is look at the sodium to potassium ratio. I mean, if there's no potassium, that food has been basically extracted from the plant, like there no remaining potassium. If you look at the carb to fiber ratio, very telling, right? If you
Hmm.
have 1 gram of fiber and you have 40 grams of carbs, that's telling you that there's not a lot of remaining fiber. Now, a lot of there are a lot of processing techniques to actually retain a lot of that nutritional value.
Yeah.
Obviously, added sugar is one that you could look at, right? But the consumers are not, you have to sort of do all of these different levers at the same time because, consumers have some role to play. Industry has a big role to play, government, right? There's not going to change the whole system without trying to pursue every option and using the carrot and the stick. I think there's a really important change recently in terms of GLP-1s, which I know you've done some research on.
Hmm.
And if you know, listen to the latest news, there's potential reductions in price for these products. And there's there have been generics that have been very much more affordable, and so I think we're going to see much wider use of these drugs. And so, can you tell us a little bit about your expectation of how does this shift the story and what we need to do and what's going to happen? Do you think you would see? I think we're starting to see maybe peak obesity in the US, potential signs of decline, which maybe GLP-1s are playing a role in. Can you share a
Yeah,
little bit
no,
about that?
sure. Yeah, and maybe I'll put it in a little bit of a perspective, kind of the way we sort of describe how our food system has changed over decades, and what sort of problems we had been experiencing in the past, right? Humanity has been struggling to, feed people enough protein and calories ever since, the beginning of agriculture, right? And we've really thoroughly solved that problem, right? We've created a food system that has essentially front loaded um, all of the incentives to produce as much protein and calories from commodity crops and as we need. In fact, we did, I think, for the first time, a calculation in the book about if you just take the major commodity crops in the U.S., it amounts to 15,000 calories per person per day is produced in those four commodity crops. It's just an insane amount. And
Wow.
if you get rid of the exports, it's still 12,000 calories. And so we're really trying to figure out ways to get rid of this calorie glut. We produce a huge amount of biofuels out of the soy and the corn, and then we also, yeah, have developed ways to kind of feed those in feedlots to livestock, right?
Hmm.
Um, so we've really front loaded the system in a way that, um, in fact, most of the increases in the calories that were available in our food system after we account for these offloading this calorie glut from those commodity crops ended up in the trash. So over the course of this period of time from the 1970s to, the mid 2000s or so, two-thirds of the increase in calories available in the food supply ended up in the trash, and only one-third ended up producing obesity, and the dramatic increases in obesity that we've seen. And so it's wonderful that the most genetically susceptible folks to that shift in our food environment now has a class of relatively widely available treatments that are successful at helping those folks navigate what has become this sort of toxic obesogenic food environment that we currently find ourselves in.
Hmm.
Um, but the point is that that's happening in a time when we now have to look to feeding the 10 billion people on the world, where we're actually going to be able to say we're going to have a plateau for the first time in human history, where we know kind of what is the sustainable amount of people that we need to feed on a planet that is warming and has other sustainability issues. I think it's amazing that we have GLP-1s that can kind of help us make the transition for the people who are most genetically susceptible to the obesogenic food environment that we front loaded with this calorie glut.
Hmm.
Now we have to figure out how to shift our food environment in ways to feed equitably and a healthy diet to these larger numbers of people. But I think what you're raising is an important other point, which is, in that transition, how can we use these drugs and how can we get better information about how they're changing food preferences, not just overall calories? How can we how can the food how can the food industry actually start to make these shifts? Because, yeah, clearly people are not going to be interested in eating as many calories as they once did, and maybe their food preferences are going to shift as well in ways that we still don't fully understand, that can actually help us make this transition. To what extent
Hmm.
can this more widespread availability of these drugs, which seem to have effects, by the way, that are going even beyond the weight loss per se, as much as that has a medical benefit, there seem to be other benefits of these drugs also. Um, and yet be also still cautious as we kind of develop new drugs and monitoring the safety of the existing drugs on the market. I think that they will play a role in these sort of more industrialized nations, and even as the right now most of these are biologics, which require, a refrigeration process and require specialized equipment to kind of inject these. There are
Hmm.
oral medications coming on the market which are not going to need that. Are going to be more widespread in nations like, India, which is also experiencing a huge amount of diet related chronic disease and might be if they're subsidized in a way, might kind of really help countries like that, which currently don't have the the cold storage system and in place to kind of use the current medications in a
Hmm.
widespread way. Yeah, I think we're really kind of at a really interesting intersection in time where we have this, finally successful obesity treatments at the same time that we need to start making transitions in our food system away from this sole focus of producing protein and calories to the maximum extent possible to feed a population which has been threatened with starvation for centuries now.
Hmm.
And yeah, I think it's a really interesting time in history.
Yeah, I think it's at least encouraging. We see a lot of movement, of course, in the US in the policy sphere that I think ultra processed foods and chronic disease is getting attention. I think it's also a bit bipartisan. Like you look at the discussions in the Senate, which have never really happened to even talk about ultra processed foods, I think is a big step forward. You combined any of the potential policies that could help regulate ultra processed foods and transition to more minimally processed foods, but also maybe less harmful or even potentially beneficial ultra processed or processed foods in combination with GLP-1s to help those, like you said, the people who are most genetically vulnerable to our food environment, obesogenic food environment. That the combination of all of these things gives me some hope that I would not have expected. I don't know if you asked me a couple of years ago. I mean, even I think a year ago. I think it's been hopefully there's some I think real progress that can be made because I think we're as a nation we're at 75% overweight or
Hmm.
obese. Many people have some sort of chronic disease, whether that's a precursor or an actual full-blown disease of heart disease or diabetes and whatnot. So I'm a bit encouraged. I'm
Yeah.
curious to know about you. You have kids, right?
Yeah. Yeah, I do.
How old are they?
They're 11 and 8.
11 and 8. Okay. So I have and they're boys.
Yes.
I have two girls. They're 5 and 8.
Okay.
So we both have an 8-year-old. But I was really wanting to know how do you handle what is your home food environment and food culture like? I just want to know like what you do
I
at
mean,
your
it
house.
is a constant challenge. I'll be honest with you. I mean, I try to kind of model good behavior in that regard. I do cook, but to be honest with you, I mean, what I end up cooking for my wife and myself ends up being a different meal than what my boys eat, right? I mean, we'll have a certain common, broccoli or green beans or rice and beans or something like that. But yeah, they'll have chicken nuggets and we'll have something else as our sort of protein or something like that.
Hmm.
There are some commonalities, like we all like salmon, but for the most part, yeah, the stuff that my wife and I eat is not what my boys are interested in, right? So, and
Yeah.
yeah, I mean, we're working parents and are faced with the same struggles that many people eat and many people face as they kind of try to navigate their home environment. So yeah, we still have ultra processed foods in the house. We try to kind of keep them away from our immediate food environment, out of sight in some sense, as much as possible, and try to promote that sort of better quality diet. But yeah, it's definitely a challenge, and at the end of the day, for sure, it's like the idea of something that is relatively easy for takeout versus sitting down and trying to figure out what to prepare that day. And yeah, you hear all the tips. It's like, oh, well, I take my Sunday afternoons and prepare all the meals. Not good for you. All right.
I
I tend
spend
to
5 hours every Sunday afternoon
uh,
to cook for the
it's
week
like
and
I just got back from like 6 hours with my youngest at an amusement park. Right, I'd rather spend my day with him at an amusement park than preparing
yeah.
meals for the week. Just going back to kind of one of the things you mentioned about the hopeful outlook and the bipartisan support for many of these things. You're absolutely right. There is bipartisan support around improving our food systems and making it easier for families to kind of feed them with high quality diets and things that are not going to lead to diet related chronic disease and yeah, I'm encouraged by that and the sort of political momentum that even at the grassroots level and the Make America Healthy Again movement. I mean, they've really put this front and center in the political sphere for the first time. And we've had a lot of really encouraging rhetoric from the leadership in the current administration. I think what's been frustrating for many of us, and what kind of puts a little damper on maybe I'm not quite as hopeful as you, is that, what we've seen so far, and maybe this is going to change in the future, is that the actions are not necessarily matching the rhetoric, right? So we've seen some actions on, food dyes, a focus on cane sugar as opposed to high fructose corn syrup, and it was again another example of introducing a line of products with cane sugar but not removing the high fructose corn syrup. And I don't think there's any sensible nutrition scientists who think that there's any meaningful difference between those two ingredients. Um, and that's where the focus has been so far. I'd be thrilled if it changes in the future. And my concern is that has been a lot of other actions that seem to be antithetical to what we want, right? The elimination of programs that deliver fresh fruits and vegetables to schools. That program through the USDA has been cut. A lot of the regulations around pesticide use on farms has been relaxed, and there's going to be no more study of those kinds of questions at the EPA. The kind of what we experienced in terms of the science being, not necessarily supported to kind of improve our understanding of ultra processed foods and what mechanisms actually aren't contributing potentially that might complicate the rhetoric. Well, that's not really appreciated by some folks in the administration. So I think that, they have time to turn it around and make some changes, but I haven't been as encouraged as I initially was when, early in January of this year, we saw these topics rise in
Mm-hmm.
national politics in the U.S. to the extent that I thought we really did have a potential impact that we could actually make some meaningful changes. I haven't seen it yet. I hope we do see it.
I've seen a mix. I've seen I think the negatives that you're talking about. I think the cut to funding. So it's hard to see a rhetoric of we want to support this movement, but then funding cut where you could see there being a further gap between the wealthy and the poor. I think that
Hmm.
a lot of the funding cuts could be doing that, right? Um, this issue with equity. Uh, I have seen there a lot of positives, like if not just at the national level, but I think about 30 states or so have actually made policies that will
Hmm.
either remove soda from SNAP, which I think is a generally good thing, and school meals, like change the school meals to uh, require, and this is, I think, a mixed thing. I think it's overall like potentially positive, but if you require, which in my state of Arizona, my girls are in public school. They eat they eat school meals at school. They're pretty bad. They really are pretty bad. Um, they were bad in California. They were in Santa Monica. They were still bad.
Hmm.
So I do support that sort of general shift. And what has been done is that they've targeted some of the potentially harmful compounds, and then schools have to figure out a way to produce that. At the same time, there are many schools that don't have kitchens.
Right.
Most schools are struggling with funding for
Absolutely.
capacity. They
Yep.
don't have the infrastructure, they don't have the staff, they don't have the training. They want to have healthier foods, right? It may
Hmm.
align with that. But then I think what's going to happen is some schools are going to fall behind. And then potentially people may want their kids who have the means to go to a different school that
Right.
is keeping up with these types of policies. And so then, okay, then the school closes. Well, it's
Right.
sort of like this kind of cutthroat
Yeah.
business
No,
mentality of, yeah.
I think you're right. I mean, I think the point is, again, we have a narrow set of policies that I think are good. I also support the limitations on ultra processed foods and certainly sugar sweetened beverages from SNAP and those kinds of programs. And we see a sort of scattershot of statewide policies that are making these kinds of changes. But what we don't see is where's the investment, right? That's what you're pointing out, right? We have
Hmm.
these laws and these kind of these waiver programs that are focused on elimination, but they're not. Where's the carrot part? Where's the part where we're actually incentivizing
That's
the
the
good
part.
things, right? And so again, we had this huge, I mean, I don't think you would have seen an uproar about saying, we're actually going to invest in these in programs where we're actually going to commit this amount of money to this. And instead, what we've seen is cuts, right? We've seen the
Hmm.
antithesis. Again, I don't think it's too late. And there are changes to the SNAP program, things that we recommend in the book. Like, right now, SNAP participants can't purchase pre-made meals, right? Like hot meals are off the table for SNAP purchases. What if we actually kind of allowed that if they met certain nutritional standards, and allowed people to
Big.
use SNAP dollars to purchase? Like, you could see little restaurants opening up in various communities that would have a new source of funding and a new source of income, as long as their meals met certain nutritional standards that could really improve, and give people options that are not the fast food options, right? And are now, you remove the convenience aspects, you remove the fact that they have to actually cook. No, they're pre-made. They're hot and ready to eat. They're in competition with your local McDonald's, right? They would
Hmm.
be, and yet potentially cheaper and much healthier for you. So, I mean, I think that those kinds of incentives and incentivized programs are what's missing right now. And like, I
Hmm.
hope we'll see them soon. But like I said, it's been a little disappointing given the political capital that the Maha grassroots movement has generated.
I think it's going to take time for I mean, I think on the right, there's for sure, and among Republicans, been this sort of deregulation approach. And so I think the Maha movement is very counter to that in
Hmm.
rhetoric, right? It's like we actually want to be standing up to big food. And so I think that part of the struggle, I actually do think a lot of the leadership are really working and want to be able to do that. But I mean, I would not have expected this sort of level of engagement on these issues to have
Oh yeah,
happened. So the fact
absolutely.
that it's
That's
even happening is like a step in, at least there's all sorts of criticisms you could have, and you have them, but there's also a lot of, I think, uh, potential benefits. And what you're saying too is like, not just the stick, like, okay, we're going to remove
right.
sugar sweetened beverages from SNAP. We're going to require schools to produce non-ultra processed meals. But what do we do to support them to do that?
Right,
And
exactly.
I actually had the opportunity to sit in. I actually spoke to a state legislator on ultra processed foods, and I sat in on another one and listened. And to me, it's fascinating. I met the person who wrote the bill for the Arizona one, and I talked to him in person about it. It was fascinating. I think there was a very large diversity of approaches. And so in one of the states, I can't remember which state it was, maybe in Michigan or Oklahoma, legislators were talking really, I think, in appropriate ways about how do we make this possible for all schools. They were talking specifically
Hmm.
about the school meals. And so they were talking about existing programs that were there that could help fund schools to provide the infrastructure and the training and the staff and all that. They talked about potentially introducing new programs. And so it's absolutely needed. I think it's just, it's never going to happen without without the positive incentive and the investment as well. You
Exactly.
can take the tax, like you could tax sugar sweetened beverages,
Hmm.
and you can fund programs that supply fresh foods or fruits and vegetables or
Right.
whatever,
Right.
right? So it's about, I think we need both, and I can see that. I think it's going to take time. There is no immediate, like what I've heard, in talking with Callie Means about this, which I know probably lots of mixed feelings about, but I've heard this vision of a 10-year plan. Like there's nothing that's going to be drastic within necessarily 1 year right away. There's a longer term vision, but what I see is if you shift procurement, that is a huge lever. Like the amount of federal funds that go towards school meals now,
Hmm.
hospitals are a lot. So if you make those shifts, there is an economy of scale that can happen where I think you can start reducing prices of more, fresh or minimally processed foods through that process. I am not like a policy expert, so I have your reservations too. I think I'm just I'm thankful that there's at least this elevation of the topic, and
Oh
I
yeah,
would love to
absolutely.
see whoever, if the Democrats take over in the next election, what I would really love to see, and what I'm trying to do is like, let's talk about the commonalities we have, because there actually
Absolutely.
is quite a lot that if we can focus, like we can have the discussions at the margin, but like there's so much consensus around some of the big things that can be done in terms of, okay, it's the hyperpalatable, highly energy dense foods, right? We're going to need different approaches. We're going to need a lot of things happening at the same time. And then we want to invest in the science. I was talking with a colleague who just received some government grants to do a lot of great work with school meals and fresh fruits and vegetables, and working with a grocery store to help provide some of those and to reduce food waste at school meals, in schools.
Hmm.
And so like that's great. And I've also heard, the other side of like my funding was cut and I
Right.
I didn't
Right.
because I had the
Yeah.
word diversity. I had the word diversity in my proposal. And I was looking at species
Biodiversity.
diversity. Yeah,
Right.
I actually have not just like heard about, but I have colleagues who have had their grants that were already received
Right.
cut because of something like that. So I think that those are really, I think, a bad thing. I think those are bad optics. But I don't think that that's again, it depends on who we're talking about. But I don't think that's the general intention of the movement. I think that that's poor implementation, and that's some probably bad decisions that were made at some point. But I hope to
Yeah,
see
no,
investment in the right
I think
funding.
I've
You know?
also experienced personally some very bad decisions at the level of the NHS,
Yeah,
which is probably a topic of another discussion. But yeah, I share with you the encouragement that this has reached the kind of level of political leadership that it needs. And we've have seen another time when this has happened, right? This was we discussed this in our book of Harvey Wiley, who was looking at, again, at the turn of the 20th century, adulteration
yeah,
of processed foods in the U.S. food supply, and how it was causing people to have a lot of acute sickness. And with the political will that took place after The Jungle was published, um, there was a movement, a very profound political movement to improve the quality of the food supply, and that happened. That was the dawn of the FDA, and so we have a model for how this can happen, right? We need to kind of do the best science, inform the right policies, and actually use that political will and that political movement to actually accomplish something really meaningful. That has happened in the past. It can happen in the future. But I think we just need to kind of I just hope that that's what happens, and I haven't seen a good example of that yet. So we'll
yeah.
leave it
I
there.
I I, I respect your skepticism. I do. I think one other lever is through the dietary guidelines, which I expect to have an attention to reducing the refined grains, to really try to put an effort on whole grains over refined grains,
Hmm.
to reduce ultra processed food consumption, to reduce the amount of added sugar. So, well, I think that stuff, all of the things could potentially add up, but I take your point fully, and I think you've experienced, I think, being within the institution, right? Within the
Yeah.
NIH, and experiencing like saying, raising your hand up, like I want to do this research. This is great. Let me
Yeah.
be involved in this, and then not getting the response that you were hoping for,
Yeah.
right? Like,
To say it mildly, yeah. Right.
okay, well, I've taken up so much of your time, Kevin. Thank you, Dr. Kevin Hall. Thank you so much for taking the time to speak with me. I've really, really enjoyed it.
Thanks, Ty. It was fun.